Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Eborn, and I am here today on behalf of the marketing team with School Health. I want to start off by thanking you for joining us today and participating in our webinar with Dr. Maria Franklin. Dr. Franklin holds a PhD in educational leadership from the University of Maine, where she is a lecturer of educational leadership in the College of Education and Human Development. She is a national board certified counselor and a Maine certified school counselor with over 20 years of experience in pre-K through 20 education. Dr. Franklin is passionate about helping students overcome the short and long-term impact of childhood adversity, and makes her an ideal guest and expert to have with us today as we go through this webinar. During this webinar, we will be reviewing the impact of childhood adversity, including the collective trauma which is associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, and will examine the impact and challenges of that trauma on learning and development. We will also consider potential manifestations of these challenges in the classroom for both regular and special education students. And we will examine how trauma-informed approaches may support students in their return to school this fall. Before I turn the time over to Dr. Franklin, I would like to review a few quick things about today's webinar. First, we will not be taking audio questions, but you can submit your questions through the questions interface in GoToWebinar. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation, and we'll take about 15 or so minutes after Dr. Franklin's presentation to address your questions. We'll address them in the order they were received. We try very hard to get through all of the questions that we receive, but if we don't happen to get to your question, please rest assured that we will reach out to you with an answer after the presentation. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recorded presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel. We will also email everyone who has registered for the webinar with a link to the YouTube recording for future playback. Additionally, everyone who attends today's webinar will be receiving a certificate of attendance for joining us today, and you should expect to receive that in your email this afternoon. Lastly, if you are having technical difficulties with the audio or visual portion of today's webinar, please call GoToWebinar directly at 855-352-9003. Again, that number for GoToWebinar is 855-352-9003. And now let's turn the time over to Dr. Franklin.
Thank you, Ryan. And I also want to thank Dr. Hype and the entire School Health team for inviting me to be here with you today. And thank you to all of you for your interest in learning about trauma-informed approaches that we can use to support our students. Ryan gave us a great overview of what we'll be talking about today. I want to spend a little time just talking about what trauma is to make sure that we're all starting with the same understanding of not only traumatic experiences, but the body's responses to stress. We'll talk about what that looks like in the classroom and how we might reframe our responses to these trauma manifestations with our students. And finally, we'll talk about promoting resilience, especially in this new climate of distance learning. So I want to begin by defining trauma. And it's important to begin here because it took the sector a long time to come up with a definition, because we've all seen experiences where one person might be traumatized by an event, but another person might not be. And it took us a while to try to find the language that would describe what's happening. So we say now that trauma is agnostic of the event. The event is one component of trauma, but it's not the entirety of trauma. There are 3 E's we want to remember: event, experience, and effect. So according to SAMHSA, a trauma is an event or series of events that is experienced by an individual as something that's harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects. And those effects could be physical, psychological, or social, or emotional. So even though one event may not cause a traumatic response in every individual, we do know that some events are typically traumatic for most individuals, and they lead to negative short and long-term outcomes. We quantify these as an ACEs score. This might be something that sounds familiar to most of us. In 1998, a study was published by two doctors at Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Felitti and Dr. Anda, and they were actually looking at adult health records. And they found that there was a commonality to the case history of adults who suffered from diabetes and heart disease. And they were able to trace these things back to what we now call adverse childhood experiences, traumatic events that occur in a child's life, things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, domestic violence in the home, substance abuse by a caregiver, mental illness in the home, exposure to suicide or death, or crime or an imprisoned family member. So we now quantify these experiences as an ACE score on a scale of 0 to 10. And we know that about 40% of our K through 12 students have an ACE score of at least 1. This is problematic because ACEs accumulate. And children who have been exposed to one ACE have an 80% chance of being exposed to additional ACEs. About 2/3 of our adult population has an ACE score of at least 1. And over 12% of adults in the United States have an ACE score of 4 or more. This is our most dangerous category because it's associated with the most dire long-term consequences, including early death. Now, while we generally define trauma in terms of individual experiences, some events are so out of the ordinary that they generate a traumatic response throughout a whole society. Our current global pandemic is a great example of this phenomenon called collective trauma. Collective traumatic experiences can lead to the onset of psychological and physiological negative impacts as our society is kind of turned upside down and our vision of reality is shattered. The fabric of society can change. And if you think about some of the things that we're doing now as we're preparing to go back to school, we're preparing students and teachers to wear masks every day. We're preparing to be 3 to 6 feet apart in our school buildings. These are new social norms in our school societies that no one would have predicted this time a year ago. So although we deal with these collective traumas as a society, there are differential impacts on individuals and the responses can vary greatly. So responses to stressors are considered either adaptive or maladaptive. These coping mechanisms that are adaptive help us relieve the stress, but maladaptive coping mechanisms actually can increase the stress. There are two basic types of maladaptive responses. We call them internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors. For those who experience internalizing behaviors, their emotions are over-controlled. They're directed inward. These are our students that exhibit somatic symptoms. You know, I have a tummy ache. I don't feel good. I'd like to call my mom to go home. These are also our students who might appear overly shy or timid in the classroom. Maybe they're withdrawn. They want to sit by themselves in the back of the classroom or pull their hood up over their head. They're reluctant to participate. And these are the students most at risk for self-injury. On the other hand, externalizing behaviors are when our emotions are under-controlled and directed outwards. These are more readily noticed. These are the students who will go through the hallways banging on lockers or shouting inappropriate language down the hall. They're physically aggressive. They don't comply with your directions. And when you ask them to turn on their computer and maybe go to Google Classroom, they might just turn on whatever YouTube channel they feel like watching. They are perceived as being defiant. But again, these are just maladaptive responses that are externalized and directed outward. So why do these things happen? From an evolutionary point of view, adaptive responses helped us to survive. And really, this is what's going on. These students are in survival mode. Trauma evokes the same survival responses as danger. Sometimes the responses are adaptive and sometimes they're maladaptive. So to understand what's happening, we need to understand the physiological changes that are going on in response to trauma. So if we take a quick overview of the physiology of the stress response, we're going to talk about two of our body systems, our nervous system and our endocrine system. These are the two systems that generally control body's stress response. The nervous system acts faster and in a more specific way. One cell gives a message to another cell and that cell reacts and then it's over. It's just a quick electrical impulse like turning a light switch on and off. And we have a variety of ways to kind of divide up the nervous system, but the ones we're going to talk about today are part of the autonomic nervous system, which controls the automatic responses of your body to things. And we divide that into what we call the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. The parasympathetic system is what we're all pretty much engaged in right now. Rest and digest, just relaxing, living normal life. And we remember the physiological responses to that parasympathetic control by the acronym SLUD. Salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, defecation. These are things that are controlled when we're resting and digesting. And I mention that now because we're going to come back to it in just a little bit. The sympathetic nervous system controls stressed behavior. So the two S's go together, sympathetic and stress. These are our fight, flight, or freeze responses. These are the things that are going to protect us from danger. So it's going to shut down the rest and digest, and it's going to get our body prepared to stay safe. Now, these results are augmented by the endocrine system. The endocrine system produces hormones. These are chemical messengers that are produced by one cell and then travel through the bloodstream to have an effect on another cell. This is important because this is a slower and more diffuse response. And once those chemicals are in the bloodstream, they have to be taken back up into other cells or destroyed by other chemicals. So their effects last longer than the nervous system responses. And the three hormones we're most concerned about in the stress response are epinephrine, which you may know as adrenaline, its cousin norepinephrine, and cortisol. And they each have a different role to play. So let's look at how these systems work together to respond to a stressor. So here I am, it's a lovely day, and I'm out for a walk in the jungle. There's a nice path, and I'm dressed for work, but what the heck, I'll go for a walk on my jungle path in my skirt and my flats. My body's under parasympathetic control. I'm just outside enjoying some beautiful weather. It's a lovely day. And all of a sudden, a tiger appears in my path. My parasympathetic nervous system shuts down. I am not in rest and digest anymore. I am in sympathetic control, a response to this stressor. Fight, flight, or freeze. I've got to figure out what to do, and I've got to figure out fast because there's a tiger in front of me. So suddenly things begin to change about my physiology. My heart is pounding. It's pumping blood faster and stronger. I'm breathing differently because I have to bring in oxygen for my cells to make energy. And I'm going to redirect my blood flow to the muscles that are going to help me escape from this danger. The other thing I need to make energy besides oxygen is glucose, sugar. I store that in my body when I'm in rest and digest mode. So that cortisol that's now pumping through my body is going to release that sugar into my bloodstream, get it to the cells so that they've got enough energy to escape. At the same time all of this is happening, my vision is changing. I no longer have pinpoint vision so I can read a book. I have stronger peripheral vision now because I need to look among the trees and see if there are more tigers around. And my hearing changes too. Again, I don't hear necessarily pinpoint sounds, but I hear a broader spectrum of sounds because I am trying to be aware of my surroundings and figure out what's the safest way for me to get out of this situation. So I decide to run away. And while I'm running away, my body is pumping out that adrenaline, that epinephrine, that norepinephrine. That is changing my heart rate, it's changing my breathing, it's changing the way my body is cooling down. That cortisol is pumping out glucose so that my cells have enough energy to pump my muscles. I'm going until I get to a safe place. So now I'm at a cave. The tiger's outside the cave. Somehow he couldn't fit through this massive door, and I'm safe. But I don't really know that I'm safe just yet. My body is trembling. That took a lot of energy. It was a huge stressor, And every little sound around me, remember, my hearing has changed to pay more attention to the periphery. So every little sound makes me jump and ready to respond again. Every little flicker of light might be the eyes of another tiger behind me. I just don't trust that I'm safe. Slowly and eventually, those hormones start to leave my bloodstream. I'm not pumping out hormones anymore because I'm sitting here at the cave, but it's taking time. Eventually, as those hormones go away, I'm now exhausted. I have no energy left, and I gradually fall asleep. When I finally wake up, my body is achy, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I have to use the bathroom. Remember, I didn't stop for a potty stop on my way to the cave, right? That's the slud part. So now I'm back in rest and digest, and I am under parasympathetic control again. So we can look at these responses on what's called the Polyvagal Chart. The rest and digest system is here in the green. This is where hopefully we all are right now. We're grounded, kind of settled and calm and ready to interact with other people. But when that danger presents itself, we move up into the yellow sympathetic zone, that fight or flight reaction. We're experiencing fear and anxiety and worry. I mean, I'm being chased by a tiger. I'm definitely concerned that I'm not going to survive this encounter. And my blood pressure is up, my heart rate is up, my oxygen is circulating to my vital organs because my lungs are changing the way they're bringing in oxygen. Beyond that, we have the freeze element. This is actually a hypoarousal beyond fight or flight, where we begin to dissociate from reality and our body actually begins to shut down. That's the real danger zone if we go past that fight or flight and into freeze. So trauma puts us in this area of our brain that we call the downstairs brain. That fight, flight, or freeze reaction is our most basic survival mechanism, and it's controlled by the most basic part of our brain that develops first. What we need to do to learn is walk up from our downstairs brain to our upstairs brain, into that frontal lobe. So different areas of the brain cause the production and release of different hormones. And to be in the green zone from that polyvagal chart, we need to be in our upstairs brain. So when we're in the downstairs brain, we really cannot learn. Physiologically, we are incapable of learning. So how does all of this relate to school? Have you ever encountered this? I have, many times. What if home is the jungle and your classroom is the safe cave? For some schools, a sanctuary, and they have been so stressed before they reach your classroom that they are either internalizing or externalizing, right? 5 minutes ago, the student might have been in the hallway shouting obscenities or banging on lockers, and he comes in your classroom, puts his head down, and finally he's in a place where he knows he's safe. And so what happens? He's exhausted, right? Remember, those hormones take a while to start wearing off. It takes some time. And finally, he's able to fall asleep. What happens when the student finally wakes up? What usually is the first thing they want to do? Go use the bathroom. Maybe not because of any intention to leave your classroom, but because they really have now their parasympathetic control back, and they haven't been able to use the bathroom because they've been stressed. And so they need to go use the bathroom. And then they're hungry because it's taken all of their energy to fight this stressor. That's what trauma does. It causes your body to be in this constant state of stress. And how do we respond to that? There's additional ways to look at that student and say, what's wrong with you? It puts the blame on the students and leverages a power mismatch between the teacher in an attempt to kind of control the student's behavior. You know, you're in my classroom, pick your head up, take your hood off in my classroom. It's this power struggle. Trauma takes power away from students. Control is a big deal. And as we have this mismatch, we're going to lose. The student will always respond from a place of challenge in that case. And what does the student hear when we say things like, pick your head up, why do you have to go to the bathroom again? You need to go to the office. What they hear is, you don't matter. Another interesting thing to think about is oftentimes when we have a student in front of us who has a trauma history, we can misinterpret those outward manifestations as ADHD. Look at the overlap between trauma and ADHD. When frustrated adults, and we all get frustrated from time to time, but when we are unfamiliar with a student's trauma history, it's very easy to conflate trauma with ADHD and assume that the student should be medicated or referred for special education. And this begins a troubling pattern. Okay? So when we have these maladaptive behaviors that tend to result in office referrals and suspensions, so exclusionary discipline, that time out of the classroom begins to impact academic performance. And as academic performance suffers, we have this cycle that begins. Okay? We have a referral to special education that may or may not be appropriate. So inappropriate referrals to special education have a significant cost. Funding is always an issue, but programs have limited capacity, and a student who is inappropriately placed in special education program might result in insufficient place in the program for students who really do need those services. And further, there are long-term consequences for the student who was inappropriately referred. According to attendance counts, 24% of students who experience exclusionary discipline ultimately drop out of high school prior to earning their diploma. And a 2011 study in Baltimore showed that 70% of chronically absent sixth graders, so chronic absenteeism is missing 10% or more of the school year, 70% of chronically absent sixth graders drop out prior to receiving their diploma. That is horrifying. So we need a fresh perspective. Young people who have experienced chronic, unpredictable, and unresolved stress rarely respond to traditional approaches. Trauma, as I said, involves this overwhelming sense of loss of control. Students seek to protect themselves by trying to maintain that control, so we end up in these power struggles. Simply being told by a teacher to sit down can call forth the need to stay in control. This is seen as students arguing or refusing to follow directions, and then we end up with that, office referral. So now that we know the neurophysiology behind the behaviors that we're seeing, we have to stop and ask ourselves whether we're blaming students for things they can't control. Knowing what we know now, we need a new approach. Okay. All behavior is purposeful, but all behavior is not intentional. Purposeful behavior means it meets a need, whether the person exhibiting those behaviors realizes it or not. But intentional means that it results from a rational decision-making process controlled by the upstairs brain. Remember, these maladaptive behaviors are controlled by the downstairs brain. Trauma makes us live in the downstairs brain. So we need to take a trauma-informed approach and separate the deed from the doer. So trauma-informed approaches have certain key assumptions associated with them. It combines the understanding of the pervasive biological, psychological, and social effects of ACEs and other traumatic experiences with the ultimate aim of ameliorating rather than exacerbating their effects. The 4 R's of trauma-informed approaches are realization about trauma and recognition of the signs and symptoms of trauma, all things that we've been talking about so far. Then our responses need to incorporate our understanding of trauma, and most importantly, we need to resist re-traumatization of our students. These key approaches are part of the underlying principles of trauma-informed approaches, which really focus around relationships and creating a safety area for our students. Again, we are providing the cave. It may take a while for the student to realize that they're safe in the cave, but we are providing that safe space. Adoption of these trauma-informed principles requires a paradigm shift for most organizations. So instead of saying what's wrong with you, we're going to say what's happened to you. Note the change of approach here. The power differential between the adult and the student is minimized, and that helps restore a sense of control. So instead of standing over the student, she's crouched down at the student's level. She's physically present for the student, showing care and concern, but not pushing the student to her own agenda. She's waiting for the student to be ready to reach out and make that connection with her. But just being there is calming for the student. You know, she's not touching. We know that touch is a trigger for some of our exceptional students, as well as some of our trauma, our students with a trauma history. So we need to be very, very careful about using touch. But the most important thing for that student is knowing that someone cares enough to be there. Now, that doesn't mean that behavior has no consequences. It does. But the way we mete out those consequences is more conducive to recovery than the old-fashioned approach of power differential. So one of the things that we need to be very careful about when working with our exceptional students is, again, mistaking the signs of trauma for ADHD and other, other qualifying conditions that may be misunderstood. So the American Psychological Association suggests that we take a trauma-informed approach to IEPs as well. This trauma-informed approach should be woven into the entire IEP process, including family engagement, assessment, report writing, and identifying IEP goals and services. Notice that this approach doesn't really change the tools or the methods that we're using, but it does change the way we're interacting with students and their families. And it changes the way we interpret the information that we are getting from the assessment process. I think this is really important because many of our exceptional students already feel marginalized and perhaps not fully a part of the school community. And this is a way to make students and their families feel appreciated and respected by the IEP team. Dr. Lori DeSottles of Butler University has done a really interesting study where she actually suggested reframing accommodations on the IEP through a trauma-informed lens. So this is just a small snippet of what she suggests, but it does point out how things like sitting at the front of the class really might mean I need a seat where I feel safe and secure. If we think about who is usually asked to sit at the front of the class, it's usually the students who are not behaving very well. And maybe the teacher wants to keep them a little bit closer or keep a closer eye on them. But what if that same student was the one who was bullying our trauma student on the bus this morning? What does that do to their feeling of safety and security? Does it relieve the trauma or does it reinforce the trauma? So this is a really fascinating way of meeting the needs of our students who might have a trauma history, reframe those goals so that perhaps they can start by regulating themselves better. So it's not just asking for help with academics, but it's also changing the number of times that they need to re-regulate themselves if they're dysregulated. So when we look at the impact of COVID-19, we see that we have changed our routines very suddenly. March 13th of last year or thereabouts, schools dramatically shut their doors with really no preamble, and it's been kind of a roller coaster ride ever since, I think. The change of routine disproportionately impacted our exceptional students because they lost many of the supports and services to which they were accustomed in a school building. There was also a significant impact on our students who experienced trauma, for those for whom home is a jungle and for whom school is that safe cave. So our teachers and students are anticipating going back to school in the fall, but what will schools look like? Will they look like what we left behind, or will they look more like this? Is this what anyone really expects to see in a safe cave of our school building, with plexiglass between the desks, social distance hugs for 6-year-olds with their teachers? You know, teenagers who can't get within 6 feet of each other or even sit next to one another on the bus on the way to school. And what if we have to shut down again? There's a significant risk of re-traumatization. Re-traumatization refers to reliving a trauma and experiencing similar, if not stronger, stress reactions. While understanding that trauma does have significant consequences, it is important for us to remember that recovery is possible and students can achieve successful and productive lives. So healthy development is a process that's fostered by 3 elements. Caring relationships are the fundamental component of resilience. And we help to form these in part by communicating high expectations and positive beliefs. This is called being a warm demander. You know, we have expectations for you, but we're going to scaffold you. We're going to help you achieve those high expectations. And we believe in you, and we are going to partner with you every step of the way. You can do it, and we're going to do it together. And we want to provide opportunities for student voice and choice because so many students who have a trauma history, again, experience that loss of control. And student voice and choice helps to reestablish that sense of control. So if we look at some suggestions for do's and don'ts of a trauma-informed classroom, first one is to create a safe space for emotional safety as well as physical safety. So if you're in a physical classroom, things like a reset corner where students can safely go, maybe calming bags, weighted blankets, those types of things where students can go and push that reset button when they begin to feel dysregulated. Predictable schedules also are helpful, and they help build a sense of trust because students come to know that you're going to follow through on what they expect of you. We're going to offer students choices. Again, that's empowering, and we'll talk about power with strategies. And ultimately, these things together will help students stay regulated. So power with strategies create a safe and inviting ecology, as opposed to the power over strategies, which again leverage those power differentials between an adult and a child. This power with is going to be something that we can do together. We're going to be warm and empathic and show an unconditional positive regard for everyone. We're going to be intentionally doing things that are for the benefit of the student. We're going to engage everything we know about that young person to try to make positive experiences for them. We're going to open up a space of equality and shared power seating, and we're going to help them see that there's a reason to be optimistic about the future. The future can be better than the present, and that person has the power to make it so. One important way to create these healthy ecologies is to co-regulate the students when they're dysregulated. This means basically tethering the student to your capacity to control your behavior to help bring them to a calmer state. Some of these techniques include things like labeling. One of the most frustrating things for students when someone says, "Tell me what's wrong," and they just don't have the words to express their emotions. They're overwhelmed by feelings, but they don't know how to describe them. So teaching them how to label their emotions, that gives them some control over them. If you can name it, you can tame it. Right? Modeling self-control strategies, modeling calming strategies will help students, again, harness onto your calm and see how you deal with stress and how you, how you manage to calm yourself when you're faced with something unexpected. Positive reinforcement is always important, especially when rules are followed. We want to create those warm, sheltering relationships. And again, being a warm demander, setting and maintaining clear expectations and limits. These are great techniques to have in your toolkit as we approach our return to schooling in the fall. But schooling isn't going to look the same. We have these new learning paradigms. Words that are being bandied about are things like hybrid learning, remote learning, online learning, distance learning, synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, and it can be overwhelming. It's a lot for educators to take in. It's alphabet soup to a lot of families who really have no familiarity with what these terms mean at all. So as we engage in various forms of distance learning, we want to make sure that our policies don't further exacerbate pre-existing inequities. Our helpful suggestions to families to create a quiet workspace at a table or a desk, or to make sure that your video is always on for synchronous learning opportunities, or to have strict schedules for participation in synchronous learning. Those things are very marginalizing for students who have experienced trauma and could potentially re-traumatize our most vulnerable students. Dr. Bruce Perry of the Child Trauma Academy suggests that we follow the 3 R's to help distance learning students move from their survival length brain to the learning brain. I think this works with students in all settings, but I think it's important that we also consider ways that we can help our distance learners, especially because their stress level, as well as that of their families, might be elevated as we learn this new paradigm. So first, we need to help them regulate, then relate, then reason. So let's take a look at each one of those. Step 1 would be to regulate. This is where we want to help the student who's currently in their downstairs brain start to feel emotionally calm and settled. The ways we can do that are to create structure through routine. So if you are engaged in synchronous learning, maybe you'll greet each student by name as they log in. You can have an unstructured chat to begin class, or have an entry activity that's posted on the screen. Asynchronous check-ins maybe are private messages to you with an emoji of how they're feeling today, so that you can gauge their readiness to go through these 3 steps. Provide or help students in creating a calming bag for home, so that if they do become more dysregulated as you go through, then they have that resource available. And be really intentional about providing breaks for physical activity. That's an important component. I mean, none of us likes to sit in front of a computer for too long, and the younger we are, the more challenging it becomes. And again, helping to restore that sense of control by providing opportunities for student input. So if you are encountering a student who's dysregulated, a great technique is to halt. And I don't mean the student needs to halt. We adults need to halt. We need to pause and ask ourselves, what am I looking at? What's going on with this child? Let's start with the most fundamental part of Maslow's triangle. Right? Is the student hungry? Are they angry? Are they lonely? Are they tired? Because if the answer is yes to any of those things, they're not going to be ready to move out of that downstairs brain and up toward the upstairs brain. We need to help with these challenges first. And by the way, it's not a bad idea to be a little reflective on your own position about this. Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? And is that influencing how I'm interpreting the student's behavior? So once we've met those needs and we still have a dysregulated child, this is a great technique to use to help students and ourselves start to calm down a little bit. This technique is fantastic because you can do it demonstratively if you're alone with the student, or you can do it really quietly just in front of their desk. This is called square breathing, and you start in the lower left corner and you trace a square with your finger as you go through the process. And you talk out loud and you talk the student through it. So if we start in the lower left corner, we go breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then move your finger to the right. Hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, breathe out, down, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now move to the left, hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you repeat that slowly and calmly. So breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in general, in the beginning, You get some looks sometimes that say, what are you doing? But eventually they join in with you, and your calm helps them to calm. That's what co-regulation means. Your calm brings them with you. And eventually students who have done this more than once will seek it out and even practice it on their own. Other things we can do are to provide a menu of activities. The Beyond Crisis Schooling Project at the University of Maine found that many school counselors provided menus of activities to students and caregivers that they could do at home while they were out for crisis schooling. I think these provide a really great way for caregivers to co-regulate, but also to strengthen those relationships with their students. The menu idea is really fantastic because, again, this provides a sense of control. The student being able to choose something from the menu helps them gain back some control over their situation and facilitates that re-regulation process. This is just a small snippet of an example of an activity grid that was provided. You can also do things like the Calm app or Cosmic Kids for guided meditations and other regulating activities. So step 2 is relate. This one is where we want to start moving from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain. And we're going to reframe challenging behaviors through this trauma-informed lens. We're going to respond and don't react, which means that we're going to use our own upstairs brain. Reactions come from the downstairs brain. Responses are thoughtful and come from the upstairs brain. This supports the development of positive interactions and the development of positive relationships. The Research Institute has done fantastic work around the elements of positive developmental relationships. And this is just an example of some of the information available through them. Step 3 would be reason. So we finally have walked up the staircase to our upstairs brains, and hopefully our students are ready and able to engage with formal instruction and learning. But of course, it's going to look very different this year than it has before with hybrid learning and more remote learning. Schooling during this global pandemic is new for all of us. So we need to model resilience and a positive outlook during the inevitable challenges. We're going to make mistakes. And it's okay for us to make mistakes, and we can use those as a learning opportunity for our students. We want to provide the time and space for students and families and yourself to figure out the new normal. One thing to remember is don't assume that students know how to use the technology. We need to intentionally teach the technology and repeat ourselves often. We also want to make sure that we remember that students with a trauma history often do not have support for distance learning. Effective and meaningful lessons may not happen all at once. Stress is going to keep our students in their downstairs brains and diminish their capacity to handle a large academic workload. So we want to reduce the workload and chunk assignments, modify accordingly. And a really great idea is to connect learning with household activities. Not every lesson has to come from a book, of course. And so if we can connect our learning to household activities, it strengthens relationships and, again, that sense of control. So to accomplish all of this, we need to take care of ourselves. We need to realize that we are all being impacted by this pandemic. The Child Mind Institute suggests looking at these priorities for self-care, prioritizing healthy choices, being thoughtful about how you're treating your body and your mind, avoiding burnout by setting realistic expectations of what you can and can't accomplish in a day, practice emotional distancing, set boundaries, turn off the news from time to time, and reconnect with things you enjoy. And some suggestions for that would be just go out for a walk. Let yourself cry if you need to. Whatever makes you feel good. This is a menu, but it's not an exclusive menu or an all-inclusive menu. These are just some suggestions that you can use. But whatever works for you is what we want you to do. So in closing, I want to reiterate that the most fundamental aspect of trauma-informed approaches is the development of positive relationships. It's the foundation on which all of these other interventions rely, and it's the one over which you have the most control. So taking time to develop relationships with students reaps rewards now and for their future. So we've unpacked a lot today, but we've only really just begun to scratch the surface of the impact of trauma on students and caregivers and ways in which we can modify our own practices to support those students. I'm always happy to continue this conversation, and so I'm providing my contact information and hope you will keep in touch. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. This was a lot of really great information. I know I've said this before, but I feel like I've learned a lot from this presentation, and I'm very grateful for you for your time in going through all of this with us. We do have some questions that have come through. I want to very first address a few questions that we've seen come through several times. First of all, will the PowerPoint slides for this presentation be available? And yes, they will. We will send out a copy of the PowerPoint presentation along with the link to the recorded presentation of this webinar this afternoon. So you can watch for that in your email. Again, those PowerPoint slides along with the recorded presentation will come to your emails this afternoon. Another question I've seen a number of times is, can we share this information with colleagues or with teachers or even with parents? And the answer to that is yes, of course. The presentation we'll be sending out, it's a link on our YouTube channel, and that link is public. You're free to share it among colleagues, among people that may be in need of these resources, and even with parents. So please feel free to do that. Just want to let everybody know that we also have, as we go through our questions and answers, we also have Dr. Ray Hype, who is our special education specialist at School Health. And we have Terry Griffin, who is our product specialist covering products for learning in early childhood as well as special education. So I will invite Dr. Hype and Terry Griffin to participate in the Q&A if they have thoughts in addition to the answers that we have from Dr. Franklin. So let me jump into some of the questions that we've received. Question for you, Dr. Franklin, from Diane. How do we know that a student has really experienced trauma?
Well, oftentimes we don't, certainly not in the classroom. And one of the challenging things, I think, is those who know can't often share that with us. The IEP team should certainly be aware of what's gone on in a child's traumatic history. But until a student has gone through the IEP process, we really don't know. The best thing we can do is make a referral to a school counselor and then begin the process of intervening for that. There's just no way to be positive as a teacher confronted with a dysregulated student. As a result, what we want to do actually is assume that all students have a trauma history. It's best practice to approach everyone as though these are challenges, and then we don't let anyone slip through the cracks.
Okay, thank you. I see another question here from Latonia. She's asking if we can run through the acronym SLUD again very quickly, please.
Sure. So that is the things that are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. So the S is for salivation, because you're getting ready to eat, and saliva is an important part of moistening food and your ability to swallow it and digest it. Lacrimation is tear formation, urination, digestion, and defecation. So salivation,
okay,
lacrimation, urination, digestion, defecation.
Okay, thank you. And I've got a question here from Tracy, and I know that we heard some of these strategies midway, maybe a little bit toward the end of the presentation. Tracy is asking for what the top 3 beneficial distance learning strategies might be that we can use with children who are experiencing or I should say exhibiting challenging behaviors because of trauma and stress. How can, and a second part to her question, how can we help the staff in our schools effectively use these strategies?
Well, I think it depends on whether we're doing synchronous learning or asynchronous learning, because those traumatic behaviors in asynchronous learning may not be so apparent. It probably is going to look like a lack of engagement. You know, students not logging in, students not completing assignments. That may not be a choice that a student is making. It could be because of environmental factors that are beyond their control. So I think the topmost thing is to not make assumptions about why students are behaving the way they are. We need to kind of keep our own biases in check. And I think the most important thing that we can do when we experience or see a student experiencing something that we're not sure about or are concerned about is to make a referral to a student support person who can then follow up with the family and see what is going on at a different level than maybe the teacher can do.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Martha that addresses social media, which is an area that we haven't really discussed very much during this presentation. Do you have thoughts on social media? Do you have times where you've seen social media specifically harming or benefiting children? And can you comment on that?
I think that social media is kind of one of those double-edged sword type of things. It can support relationships among peers, and it can also promote bullying and further diminishing self-efficacy beliefs of students very quickly and very easily. My biggest concern with social media is that it's so hard to know who is sending certain messages. You know, the students are very adept at creating ghost accounts where you can't follow up on who sent what message. And it's also kind of this constant thing that students can't escape. They're afraid to log out because then they're ostracized for not being on. But when they are on, they might be receiving messages that are inappropriate or downright scary sometimes. So proper social media use can positively support relationships among friends, but inappropriate social media use is very, very challenging and could put some of our most traumatized students up into that red zone on the Polyvagal Chart to the point where they begin dissociating and shutting down, and that's very, very concerning.
Absolutely. And Dr. Hype, I know that you've written a blog for us on social media and students with exceptional abilities. Can you offer some thoughts here as well?
Certainly. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, Dr. Franklin. That was very insightful. Taking a look at things, when we are assessing a student, whether or not they're feeling trauma, one of the things that we do notice from social media posts that the students are doing is that they begin to take stronger views towards certain ideas. So whether it be, you know, it's easy to say political ideas, but sometimes it's just a view on a class. Oh, this class is boring, or this class is stupid. I don't like this class. And these might be reactions that we normally would not have seen from this student. That's actually potentially some evidence of the stress levels that the students are dealing with. So we do want to take that seriously too when we're looking at, okay, let's assess where our students are at. You know, within this question of how do we know if the students have gone through trauma, we as a country and realistically as a planet have gone through some significant trauma with this pandemic. And it's going to therefore be coming out in a multitude of ways. Social media, unfortunately, has been one of the easiest ways for people throughout the globe to actually express their frustrations with the world and frustrations with things that are going on. So we do want to be cautious about when we're working with our students when it comes to social media. We do want to see what they're saying too, because again, that could be evidence of higher levels of stress that may not be exhibited in other ways.
So Dr. Hype, if I could just follow up with a question about that. You say that social media can impact the way students maybe comment about a class, do you also see that impacting the way they talk about one another?
Yes, indeed, you are spot on with that. And where we start to worry, and I know, Dr. Franklin, this is right up your alley when it comes to the counseling idea, we have to be very cautious of bullying in this day and age too, and cyberbullying.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, thank you both. That was some great information. Dr. Franklin, I've got a message here from Carol, who says that her school has been learning more about ACEs, and she's wondering if there are other resources that might be available for resilience training.
Oh gosh, yes, there are many. I mean, really just too many to name. There are a lot of different, like I said, if you're looking at a special education population, Dr. Laura DeSoto from Butler University has done some great work around that. The Child Trauma Academy has done some great work, Search Institute, quite a variety. Maybe what we could do is compile a list of resources, Ryan, and make that available to people who might be interested. That'd probably be easier than me just naming some right now.
That makes sense. So Carol, what we'll do is we will kind of get together on our end and put together a list of resources, and we'll make sure that we email that out to everyone who has joined us here today, so that you have those resources as well. We're getting close on time at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Dr. Franklin, Dr. Hype, and Terry, for helping us with this presentation today. This has been a lot of great information. I really appreciate Dr. Maria Franklin sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Before everyone signs off in the audience, when you sign off of the webinar, you will see a survey window pop up, and I would ask for each of you to participate in that survey if you're able. It should just take a couple of moments, but that lets us know how we've done here today, if there are things that you would like to see but were not able to see, or if there were things that you did see that really just resonated with you and that you'd like to see more of. Please let us know so that we can continue to make these presentations better and better over time. So with that, I will end today's broadcast. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Franklin, for your time, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.